Bonjour, I am so pleased to be here. I have a short presentation to give to you, so I'm going to hopefully share my screen with you now, and I will begin to talk you through this. So my challenge here is to give some thoughts about what's next for knowledge transfer, and I'm looking forward to hearing perhaps some of your views too. I think before we start to look forward, we just need to spend a short moment thinking about where we actually are now, what we do and why we do it, and then who are the decision makers and how do they judge what we do. And it's quite complex. I'm always delighted at the word valorisation. It's not something we embrace easily as native English speakers, but I think it sums it up very well. I find that we tie ourselves in knots talking about commercialization, engagement, tech transfer, and that really disguises what it is that we do, which is usually very broad. But the question is, why do we do it? We know in our hearts why we do it. You've just seen a fabulous video that I think pulls that all together. But is it about money? Is it for economic benefit? Is it to help justify positions in league tables? Is it about getting funding? It's potentially many of those, and that's important to think about when we also think about who's making the decisions around knowledge transfer. We might like to think it's us, but it may be the people in our universities, our faculty, the policymakers and some of the funders. And then that determines what we're measuring and how we're measuring it, because it depends on what it is that people want from us, not only what we want to produce. We have a system, I think, that is slightly in balance. Collaboration creates intellectual property for companies, and it's often licensed direct to those companies, often at a very modest value, which is absolutely fine. New ideas and new IP will often be licensed out to existing companies or to spin-off companies. But actually, a force for collaboration, which funders often require of us, and a desire for us to produce more spin-off companies does exist in a little bit of tension. And that's something that we need to think about balancing as we go forward. And we need to have conversations around that, because expectations are not always realistic. I break the key stakeholders when we think about what it is that they might want of us into 4 groups: companies, entrepreneurs and investors, people who make the policies, and our universities themselves. And when we look at the companies, of course, they're such a diverse group, large and small. Some of them will want long-scale projects, some short-term. Many of them are increasingly getting involved in projects with us that are multi-party and involve several people. We hear from the larger companies that they say, we will go wherever research excellence lies. We know that smaller companies, SMEs, like to go locally. And I have heard in some countries that the companies that are based there will say, we'll work anywhere but here, and want to go work with other universities in neighbouring countries. So there really isn't any single size that fits all, except for the fact that the majority of them love the ability to access funding, and universities can do that for them. They hate the bureaucracy. We can do that for them, and I think that's going to be an important direction of travel for the future. But we need to be realistic. Do these companies all have the capacity and the capability to work with us? Our policymakers like to think that they do. In reality, they don't. And the different sectors will need different treatments, different outcomes. I think one of the important things that companies are being braver about saying now is that they're interested in access to talent, to ideas, to new people, to potential employees. And that's often a major driver of working with us. It's not about the IP. And so I'd hold that thought. When we think about entrepreneurs, the traditional heartland was the internal entrepreneurs, and it was our researchers. We're doing more with students, or maybe we should be doing more with students as they create their spin-offs. And also there's been a lot of move towards external entrepreneurs. We see entrepreneur in residence schemes. We're seeing quite a lot of spin-in companies into the university. And we're seeing both universities and funders creating new and dedicated programs to help more companies arrive either from internally in the university or coming in from the outside. And we need to take note of that. Policymakers are national, they're at EU level, and they're regional. And they have different goals, but primarily they're about economic development. Metrics can get in the way because they'll often count what can be easily measured. And what they want to count is not necessarily the same as the next funder might want to count. And in some cases may differ quite substantially between programs. Some have short and long-term policies and interventions. And there are many, many different initiatives out there, and this is only going to increase. And in this complexity, they will look to the university as the easiest target in terms of good performance or bad performance. And we actually need to be aware of that. And then when we think about our universities, what really matters to them? Let's be honest, it's about funding. It's about generating research income. It's about bringing in partners that will bring the euros in. And it's about generating income from various funders. League tables matter, no matter how much they say they don't. Every vice-chancellor, every rector looks at those league tables. And for our academic colleagues, it's about funding and it's about career progression. So there are important things to bear in mind when we think about what our future is going to look like. So how have our innovation systems been evolving? I think we've seen a lot change recently. When we look at the funding and the financing landscape, what we're definitely seeing is that we need to take opportunities further forward before it can be commercialized. I don't need to tell you that, but it does have implications for patent budgets, for proof of concept type funding, and even for what we're seeing as pre-proof of concept. And spin-offs fit in there as well. We're seeing that we need to take spin-offs further before they're ready to get investment. And I think what's proving to be quite interesting is that companies now seem to want to interact more with a spin-off than with the university. They see the spin-off as being able to de-risk an early technology, so they don't have to license it too early. And sometimes they see a spin-off as an opportunity to collaborate with an organization that's more focused and more agile than it would be if they were dealing with a university. On the other side of the house, we're seeing a lot more funding, I think, through research for programs that work with industry, that encourage collaboration. And with all of those, there's a requirement for us to talk about the outputs and what impact has been generated. Also, there's been a rise in intermediary organizations which can offer economies of scale or specific expertise. And there's a whole bunch of examples out there, but they're anything from centralizing all functions, centralizing certain functions, universities getting together and deciding, for example, that they want to develop incubators and accelerators together. And it can also be funders who are particularly good in an area offering to do research commercialization. There isn't one single way of doing this, there isn't a right way, but it's definitely an increasing trend. And then, of course, the word that I've already mentioned, impact. The impact agenda has become much more important and will continue to be important. I think what is significant about impact is that it's having an impact itself. Our funders are asking, what is the impact of the funding? Because actually their governments and ministries are asking them, what was the point of that? And it's moving beyond the simple metrics to a much more complicated narrative of impact. We're actually seeing pro-vice rectors and vice provosts for research having the word impact in their job titles. It is here to stay, but it's much broader than knowledge transfer itself. And that has implications for the knowledge transfer profession, Either we're becoming more skilled, spending more resource in times of assessing what the impacts are and also thinking what they could be when we're going after funding, or there's other people within our universities who are taking on that impact job with whom we have to interrelate. And then there's changes within the European Commission itself. So the EU Council has asked the Commission to develop a strategy for knowledge transfer and commercialisation. Very simply put, they don't think we're doing a good enough job at getting research commercialised out there and used. They're saying that we need to do more in terms of collaborating with industry. I think as importantly, industry needs to do more about collaborating with us. And they're saying that spin-offs and startups are very important. So they're the two main channels that we use for knowledge transfer, and the Commission want to see more of that. Thankfully, they do at least acknowledge that knowledge transfer officers exist and have a role to play. There's a whole bunch of different interventions that the Commission has come up with, both in terms of how they're structured and the funding that's available for anything from collaboration with SMEs through to venture capital type funding. What I think is quite interesting is last year there was the creation of the IP valorisation policy unit, which is doing just what it says. It's looking at different policies and different initiatives that might need to be brought into place to increase valorisation. I think we're seeing quite a few changes as well across the different channels that we use for knowledge transfer. Open innovation is a trend. We're seeing more consortia develop with companies and with universities. We're seeing centres being created that will work with companies, often focused on companies' needs. We're definitely seeing large and small companies working together with universities, and that's positive and something that many ministries want to see encouraged. But I'm not sure we entirely all understand what the word open innovation means. I know there's the Henry Chesbrough definition, but in practical terms, I think one person's open innovation means everything available for free. Somebody else's open innovation means groups of people getting together, sharing knowledge, but perhaps benefiting in very specific ways to them. So we just need to be cautious of that word, but definitely a trend of bringing more companies together and more universities together in common areas and themes. Everybody likes a strategic alliance and everybody wants one, but in truth, they're mainly limited to the larger companies who will have a deep and significant partnership with a limited number of universities. And I think as we go forward, that's only going to increase. And by increase, I mean the limited number of partnerships with a limited number of universities. We are seeing universities that are developing corporate relationship offices, and they're offices which are looking beyond just the research alliance to what is the whole offering that can be given to potential partners that they'd like to work with. And that's anything from accessing the student base to working with the alumni office to helping with consultancy activity. It really is very diverse. And I think that's a trend that's going to continue beyond the research programme. And of course, beyond industry. Our profession is evolving so that we are looking at, and should be looking more, at how universities engage with the public sector, with charities and non-governmental organisations, and with others, sometimes with the public at large, and that in itself can be really challenging. I think in terms of licensing, we're definitely seeing changes. More IP is flowing through collaborations to existing partners in that collaboration, and that often means that the revenue returns are going to be lower. We're seeing more IP being licensed into spin-off companies. The returns will be long-term and may only be equity related. And I think we're beginning to see less new intellectual property simply being packaged and licensed out to an existing company to form a product. So the revenue that we're getting in is going to differ across the different channels that we're using. And we need to think about how we balance that more, rather than simply looking for net revenue to the university as a marker of success. And I think we still importantly have to make sure that the message is understood, which it is in large part, that a KTO, a technology transfer office, it's highly unlikely that it's going to be self-sustaining and self-financing. Spin-offs, as I've said, are really interesting in that they can now de-risk our opportunities and take them further. And they can also allow us to access funding that we couldn't access as a university, either pre-investment with the spin-out in mind or as the company forms. And of course, they're a great route to job creation, and that's going to be important going forward. I think for us in our profession, what we've seen is that the support that we need to give to spin-offs is becoming much more comprehensive. No longer are we just an IP developer looking at how we could commercialize that opportunity and support the researchers to do it. We need to be project managers. We need to pitch for funding. Sometimes we'll be given funding to manage either ourselves or as a group in terms of proof of concept. We need to manage networks, and we need to be able to find the talent, the management for the new companies. It really is quite complicated and requires significant resourcing. And expertise and talent. When we think about what it is that companies want, as I said, they're often looking for people and ideas. We need to think about that very carefully, and we need to understand that on the whole, that's why companies collaborate in various forms, whether it be a one-to-one collaboration or many companies with many universities. But if we can understand why they're collaborating, it might determine the kinds of deals we put into place with them. And of course, the idea of STEAM, bringing the arts, humanities and social sciences much more into knowledge transfer. We know it's the right thing to do. We've seen a lot of good examples as to where particularly the social sciences can really blend and support the more traditional technologies. But I think we're still struggling about moving that into practice. And I do wonder going forward into a different economically challenged world where that's going to sit in terms of what's being expected for us in knowledge transfer. I just want to reflect for a moment on the changes that have gone on to knowledge transfer operations. As I've mentioned, I think the breadth and depth of knowledge transfer that we're required to support has changed significantly. We have to do more, both in terms of the detail of what we have to do around certain things and how far we have to stretch ourselves to do that. And I do wonder if the funding and the resourcing that we have available for our offices has similarly grown to do it. We have had to be very agile. That's going to continue, but it's only finite. We've seen the increase of qualifications for knowledge transfer offices, and I'm particularly thinking there of the RTTP qualification. It's proved very helpful in certain countries to be able to justify to ministries and to others that actually it's a cadre of professionals within the country who are supporting knowledge transfer, not just, and I hesitate to say it, not just a bunch of failed scientists or administrators, which sometimes is how the knowledge transfer profession is thought. It also justifies an investment in the profession itself. Look, we've been judged by international peer review. There's a quality standard, and many of our offices have people who pass that. Spin-off support, I think that's changing, as I said, becoming much more comprehensive. The models that we're using to collaborate together, whether we choose to do it or whether funders are asking us to do it, are changing. We're becoming much more collaborative, and we're outsourcing some of our activities. And as we're required to do more, potentially with less, we may have to think about more collaboration and more outsourcing. And we've had to be explaining the value add that we bring. It's very easy if you're in a standalone KTO and your job is IP commercialization and nothing else. You can sometimes explain your value add if you've been fortunate enough to generate a lot of revenue. But if you look behind the numbers and you look at published accounts, when you actually take into account the cost of running an office, you perhaps look at the grant, the gift that has been given to it by the university, You look at the payment of direct costs, you look at the payment of rewards to inventors, and possibly a gift aid back to the university. Actually, we're still in a position where very few of us really can self-sustain through profit. So explaining value add is really important, and that goes back to the beginning. What value is it that our stakeholders want from us? So as I get towards the close of my presentation, here's 5 for the future that I think are going to be very important to us, actually later this year, if not into next year. As I say, the business models that we're using for our offices, they're going to have to change. They are changing. That's going to increase. Intellectual property and the value that we place on it, that's been changing. It's going to have to keep changing. We're going to need more interaction with SMEs. We're going to have to not do very exquisite deals that require a lot of revenue. We just need to get working with them as part of helping restart our economies. Student startups are going to become increasingly important. And for some of us, we're going to have to think hard about how we're supporting students beyond the business plan competition to actual practical support around helping them find funding, helping them find management, etc. Open innovation and how we work with different kinds of companies and how we provide the platform and the glue to bring those different companies together, again for economic development and to help that company value chain, going to be very important. And performance data are increasingly important. I've written here Own the Narrative. I think we collectively, and I'm particularly looking across Europe here, need to make sure that we are collecting the right kind of data and metrics and that we're using it in the right way to tell the stories that we need to tell about knowledge transfer and about our profession. Because if we don't, simplistic metrics will be placed upon us and it will be harder for us to do what we need to do in the way that we need to do it. So in closing, I just wanted to present what I see as this year's challenges and opportunities. I've already heard it said in some quarters, universities and knowledge transfer will reignite the economy. But be careful what you wish for. If we say that too loudly, if we try to promise that too much, and we don't deliver, and let's face it, we need to be working with the companies and have the right investment environment that we can, we might find things are a little difficult. We need to still think long term when everybody around us is thinking short term. And to do that, we're going to have to be quite brave and we're going to have to be vocal. And that's where national associations, I think, will really come into their own. And there's going to be huge financial challenges for universities. We know that, there have been already. So we know that a KT's office's role is to help support the university's income generation, but its role is not to be a revenue generator. The kinds of things that we can do can help support the overall agenda for the university as it itself goes out and brings in more funding, as it scores well in league tables, as it can attract more students who may be fee paying. But as I say, we still have to remember that the KTO is a cost centre. Having said that, I do think that never before have we had such an opportunity for the value of research to be seen and such an opportunity for the role of knowledge transfer to finally be understood. Thank you.